Hello, everybody. Welcome and thank you all for coming for the fourth lecture of our commemorative series of conference on the work of John Rawls. I'm Professor Daniel Simão Nascimento, one of the organizers of the event and the host for this meeting. Our guest lecturer today is Professor Samuel Freeman. Professor Freeman is the Avalon Professor of the Humanities and Professor of Philosophy of Law at the University of Pennsylvania, and he's most certainly one of the most important specialists we have in the works of John Rawls. To debate his lectures, we have Professor Julia Moura, Lucas Petroni, and Raissa Wiebe. Although we had a late cancellation of Professor Sam Romanelli, who we would all love to have here today to debate Professor Freeman's lecture, due to some urgent administrative duties that required her immediate attention, I do believe we are well set up for a very interesting discussion. For those of you that are joining us for the first time, let me brief you quickly on our protocol. The lecture will be delivered in full, then we'll have a round of questions from our debaters before moving on to any question from the audience. Now, in the chat, you have Professor Freeman's PowerPoint, but he will share that during his presentation. Those of you who need certificates should fill in the form that also will be made available in the chat very soon. Now, we have two students here, Thiago and Mauro, who have kindly agreed to help us with any translations we need. So those of you who would like to ask questions but are not comfortable speaking in English can either write the questions in Portuguese in the chat or ask for the words, give your questions in Portuguese, say them in Portuguese, and then they'll translate them for Professor Freeman. So last but not least, let me briefly thank them all for their presence here today, everybody. And without any more delay, welcome Professor Freeman to our series of seminars. Samuel, the floor is yours. Thank you very much for accepting our invitation.
Well, thank you for having me. I'm very pleased, honored to be invited. I mean, it makes me happy that people outside the United States are still interested in Rawls. I mean, as you say, it's been 50 years since the publication of Theory of Justice, and it's extraordinary, really, how long Rawls's influence has continued. I mean, it's really unusual in philosophy for a philosopher to have such a governing sort of influence of discussion for so long. So. Thank you for inviting me. So I have a paper. It's about it's a shorter version of a longer paper. And it discusses Charles Mill's Tanner lecture, which he gave in February 2020, University of Michigan. And I was one of the respondents. So this paper grew out of that. My response to Charles Mills back on February 21st, 2020, before his, which was just a year before his death, back in October or September rather. And this paper is to be published along with his Tanner lectures and responses by Michelle Moody Adams and Nikhil Singh and Anthony Layden, and Elizabeth Anderson is doing the introduction to it. And this should come out by Oxford University Press in sometime next year. Charles, before he died, was actually working on the responses to my paper and the other three papers. And I'm not sure how much he completed of it, but that's the context in which this paper was written. I don't know if you had an opportunity to look at Charles Mill's Tanner lecture, but if you're familiar with any of his work, a lot of this will be familiar. A lot of what I'm discussing. So I'm going to put the screen share on so you can see the good the yeah. What? Yeah, so the paper's Ideal Theory and Racial Justice, as I say. So in his recent, excuse me, let me minimize this. Yeah, in his recent Tanner lecture of February 2020, Charles Mills focuses on John Rawls's claim, which Rawls made in Justice is Fairness, the Restatement. Rawls says his theory of justice is designed for a democratic society and not a racist one. But Mills insists that the United States is indeed a racist society. So Rawls's theory of justice cannot apply to assess or correct the long history of racial injustice in the United States, Mills says. Rawls's, quote, ideal theory of justice is, Charles Mills argues, largely irrelevant and hence inapplicable to non-ideal unjust societies such as the US and other Western societies. And this means, Mills concludes, that for 50 years, philosophical discussions of justice largely have been governed by a theory of justice which does not even apply to our situation, but instead applies to a fantastical, well-ordered, and perfectly just society. Mills concludes that Rawls' entire body of work is a diversion, it's masked racial injustice, and for that reason is the theory of justice and his other works are works of epistemic injustice. Now, Mills does not deny or question Rawls's fundamental assumption of moral equality of all persons, nor the social and political equality of all citizens that's implicit in Rawls's principles of justice, nor does he deny Rawls's economic egalitarianism. He doesn't deny Rawls's principle of equal basic rights and liberties, or substantive equal opportunities, or economic reciprocity and the difference principle. He doesn't even reject Rawls's original position in Veil of Ignorance. Instead, he adapts the original position in the Veil of Ignorance to address racial injustice in his own proposed non-ideal theory of corrective racial injustice. So this is not a major departure from Rawls either, because Rawls explicitly endorses the extension of the original position to address injustices within non-ideal theory. So where does Rawls go wrong, according to Charles Mills? Rawls's primary offense is one of omission. His exclusive focus on ideal theory for a well-ordered democratic society prevents Rawls from addressing questions of racial injustice and rectification for African Americans and other Blacks, as well as Native Americans and other people of color who have been oppressed by the white majority in the United States and in other Western societies. And for this transgression, Rawls's theory of justice, including the principles of moral, social, and political equality that his theory embodies, as well as his critique of capitalism, they're all pronounced Jim Crow philosophy and complicit with a long history of, quote, racial liberalism. Now, I'll not contest Charles Mills' claim that the United States is a racist society. Instead, I want to focus on what I believe to be his significant misinterpretation of Rawls's work, which is central to Mills' indictment of Rawls. It's Mills' long-standing argument that Rawls's ideal theory of justice does not apply to non-ideal circumstances to assess the injustices of actual societies, including racist societies, but rather only applies to other ideal societies for which it's designed. Now, I'll argue the contrary, that Rawls's ideal theory and a theory of justice applies to all societies, no matter how unjust. Also, political liberalism applies to racist societies. They're also democratic. I argue that racial injustice involves the systematic violation of each and every principle of Rawls's ideal theory of justice. Also, the proper rectification of racial injustice that Mills seeks requires the application of the same liberal egalitarian principles that Mills claims are irrelevant to our society. So the second section of the paper is on ideal theory and the application of justice as fairness to a democratic society. Charles Mills has long argued that Rawls's theory of justice is not relevant to our non-ideal unjust world because it's designed to apply to a perfectly just, well-ordered society. Now, Mills was one of the earliest critics of Rawls's use of ideal theory back in an important article back in 2004, together with Amartya Sen somewhat later. And since their criticisms, a very large critical literature has evolved, which contends that ideal theory is utopian and irrelevant to contemporary societies. Now, it's ironic that Rawls's theory of justice is regarded as utopian because he made great efforts to avoid that charge. He devotes a large part of a theory of justice in part 3, also in political liberalism, to arguing for the feasibility and what he calls stability of justice's fairness, arguing that his conception of justice is compatible with human moral psychology, with social theory, and realistic democratic institutions, and what he thought is our natural sense of justice. And he argued in Theory of Justice that acting for the sake of justice is even congruent with the human good, that we realize the human good by acting for the sake of justice. Mills contends, however, that as ideal theory, Rawls's theory of justice only applies to perfectly just, or at best, nearly perfectly just societies. And since the United States is not even nearly just, but is a racist society, Rawls's theory of justice can't apply to us. Mills rightly notes that this is not how Rawls himself regarded his view. Rawls, he says, thought the US was a nearly just society that's troubled by racism. But this misperception was grounded in a liberal white philosopher's inability to recognize how unjust and profoundly racist the basic structure of American society really is, Mills claims. But in fact, Rawls did not regard the United States as a nearly just society. He explicitly denies the United States is just or even nearly just. For example, soon after Theory of Justice was published, in 1973, Rawls publicly stated, I would find it very difficult to see how anyone who has lived in this country could think that it is a just or nearly just society, as I define justice. To think this is to fail to work out the implications of the principles of justice. Also in Rawls's 1995 reply to Habermas, he says existing societies contain grave injustices, as American society did and still does. But the fact that Rawls did not see that the United States as just or nearly just, according to his principles of justice, does not rebut Charles Mills' main charge, which is that Rawls's ideal theory of justice does not apply to our unjust society, in spite of the fact that Rawls thinks it does apply. The reason Rawls's principles of justice do not apply to the United States on Mills' account is that Rawls's ideal theory of a perfectly just democratic society is incapable of providing a basis for non-ideal theory that rectifies a history of racial injustice in a racist society. To address racial injustice in our racist society, we need a non-ideal theory of corrective racial justice completely different from Rawls's ideal theory. The ideal theory of a perfectly just society where everyone complies with principles and requirements of justice is simply inapplicable to seriously racially unjust societies. Well, I'll argue the contrary, that any non-ideal theory of justice that addresses the ongoing history of racial injustice in the US and Western societies must be grounded in the ideal theory of a democratic society and apply to our unjust non-ideal world. Non-ideal theory presupposes and is inseparable from ideal theory. There is no non-ideal theory of injustice that does not build upon an ideal theory of justice, since what makes non-ideal theory non-ideal is just that it addresses departures from the fundamental principles of ideal theory. Now, this is not simply a matter of semantics or terminology. The deeper point is that to fully address the historical injustices of racism, we must first know what the fundamental principles and requirements of justice are, just as to adequately address the flaws of invalid arguments, we first need to know the principles that govern invalid inferences and arguments. So what are Rawls's aims in the theory of justice? Well, in the preface to Theory of Justice, Rawls says his aim is to develop a theory of justice that generalizes the traditional theory of the social contract of Locke, Rousseau, and Kant He says his theory best approximates our considered judgments of justice, that it offers a superior account of justice to the utilitarian tradition, and that it constitutes the most appropriate moral basis for a democratic society. He does not say his theory only applies to a democratic society. In fact, Rawls tries to tell us what justice requires, regardless of the society or historical era in which his theory is applied. His general conception of justice applies to unfavorable conditions, which include non-ideal societies that have not yet reached a stage of development where they can protect equal basic rights and liberties and the other requirements of Rawls's special conception consisting of the two principles of justice. The two principles in serial order with priority given to the equal basic liberties are, Rawls says, quote, the long run tendency of the general conception of justice. Rawls explicitly state that the principles of justice apply to any society capable of maintaining the priority of the basic liberties, right? I mean, these are non-ideal, unjust societies, but if they're capable of maintaining the priority of basic liberties over the second principle of justice, the principles of justice apply to them. He says, quote, the equal liberties can be denied only when it's necessary to change the quality of civilization so that in due course everyone can enjoy these freedoms. So Rawls clearly thought in Theory of Justice that justice is fairness, and the two principles of justice should apply to assess injustices in any society capable of sustaining basic rights, no matter how unjust that society may be. Otherwise, the general conception of justice applies. Now, Mills does not say why any of the specific equal basic rights and liberties and opportunities or natural duties in Rawls's principles of justice should not apply to the US or unjust societies. Instead, to support his argument that Rawls's conception of justice does not apply to unjust societies, he appeals to Rawls's justice as fairness, the restatement, as the final definitive statement of Rawls's view. And Rawls says there on page 14 that justice as fairness is a political conception of justice for the special case of the basic structure of a modern democratic society. Now, this claim is not significantly different from Rawls's claim in the first edition of Theory of Justice, where he says justice as fairness, quote, constitutes the most appropriate moral basis for a democratic society. There, Rawls intended his theory of justice in theory to set forth requirements of justice for all societies, whether they're democratic or not. So why should we assume that Rawls thought otherwise 20 years later in the restatement? Well, the reason Mills provides is that he refers to a statement Rawls makes 7 pages later on page 21, where Rawls says, from the start, then, we view a democratic society as a political society that excludes a confessional or an aristocratic state, not to mention a caste, slave, or a racist one. It's this second sentence that Mills heavily relies on, that a democratic society excludes, quote, a racist one, which he joins with Rawls's earlier claim that justice is fairness is a political conception for the basic structure of a democratic society. Mills infers that if a political conception is designed for a democratic society, then it cannot apply to a racist society. But this can't be right. Simply because something's constructed for some purpose does not mean it cannot be applied to other purposes. Mills consistently conflates these two different ideas. For a conception of justice constructed for a democratic society to apply to a society simply means that it provides appropriate standards for judging the institutions of that society. Rawls's conception of justice provides appropriate standards by which to judge a democratic society such as the United States, which is marked by a continuing history of racism. Rawls's theory also provides appropriate standards to judge a racist society that pretends to be democratic. Call this a racist democratic society, as the United States was from its constitutional beginnings in 1789 up through the Civil War, then on into the 20th century, at least until the Civil Rights era, 1964 and afterwards. But if Mills insists, even up to the present day, we're a racist democratic society, I'll grant that. For what other standards are more appropriate for assessing the injustices of US history and society than Rawls's, or at least some other liberal egalitarian standards of justice? Mills doesn't suggest an alternative, nor does he argue that Rawls's liberal egalitarian principles themselves are unjust or otherwise inappropriate. Instead, he relies upon liberal egalitarian principles to condemn the history of enduring racism in the West. But he argues these principles do not address and rectify the history of continuing racial injustice. Now, even if this is true, it doesn't mean that Rawls's conception of justice does not apply to assess and criticize the many injustices that mark the history of the United States and other Western societies. For a democratic society, this is another section. Charles Mills contends the United States is not a democratic society, or even a democratic society marked by racism, but that the US is fundamentally a racist society that has been and still characterized by white supremacy, in spite of our ineffective efforts to eradicate racism from social and political life. I agree that there's extensive racism and significant racist bias and discrimination embedded in American society. Racism in large part accounts for the 2016 election by almost 50% of voters of Donald Trump as president and continuing support for him. Nonetheless, there are also considerable democratic tendencies within American political and social institutions and practices. So what does Rawls mean when he says his conception of justice is for a democratic society? One thing he means is that in a democratic society, the ideas of freedom and equality are widely held by members of society and are part of its political culture. Even if these ideas are not consistently practiced, and there's still people who are openly racist or who believe they are not racist, but still exhibit racial prejudice. Now, Joshua Cohen contends in For a Democratic Society that Rawls means three things by a democratic society. First, a democratic society involves the absence of feudalism and aristocracy, and its members are recognized in its political culture as free persons who are morally and socially equals. Second, a democratic society has a democratic form of government with representative legislatures, equal political rights, and regular elections. Third, a democratic society aspires to be a deliberative democracy where political argument appeals to reasons that address the common interests of free and equal citizens. Now, Mills denies that US is a democratic society and instead insists it is a racist society, as if the two are mutually exclusive. But considering the wide appeal of the political values of freedom and equality in US political culture, and the three features of a democratic society Joshua Cohen mentions, the word democracy does not mischaracterize US government society, even though racial prejudice and explicit racism are still widespread. The United States is a constitutional democracy whose 50 states are all constitutionally required to have a democratic form of government. Also, the US Constitution explicitly prohibits titles of nobility. And since the 1950s, the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment has been interpreted by the Supreme Court to guarantee equal opportunity and allow affirmative action for racial minorities in education, guarantees equal rights of citizens to vote and hold office, equality of constitutional rights and liberties. All of these are essential to a democratic society. Appeals to consideration of the common good and shared common interests, as Rawls says in Theory of Justice, a political convention of democracy in the United States. However hypocritical these appeals by politicians and private interests so often might be. Finally, the principles of a racist, caste, and aristocratic society are publicly condemned and rejected in our political culture. Mills, however, contends that the United States has made, at best, half-hearted efforts at enacting the ideals of a democratic society, and that our current conservative Supreme Court and state governments are retreating from democratic ideals. Also, Mills focuses not simply on democratic institutions, the political roles of ideals of freedom and equality in our public culture and so on. He looks instead at our history and actual racist practices and prejudices that have endured among a sizable portion of the US population. He claims that even if there are certain basic institutions that can be pointed to by Rawls in alleging that our society is democratic, nonetheless, non-institutional social norms and practices and the actual workings of social and political institutions reveal that we are instead a racist society plagued by systemic racism. Now, Rawls assumes in the theory of justice that a democratic society whose members are regarded as free and socially equal persons is a precondition to justice under modern conditions, and that this democratic ideal supplies the standards by which to assess the degree of injustice within all existing societies. So even if we grant that Mills is right, that our basic structure and social practices are those of a society that is more racist than democratic, this still means that we're a racist democratic society and that is fundamentally unjust, according to Rawls's and any other liberal egalitarian account of justice. The fact that we are a racist democratic society is simply irrelevant to the application of Rawls's conception of justice to the United States, so long as Rawls's liberal egalitarian principles are the appropriate standards by which to assess the injustices of our racist democratic society. It's clear that in a theory of justice, that justice's fairness applies to any society capable of protecting basic liberties and their priority. For societies incapable of doing so, the general conception applies. I don't think Rawls intended to significantly change this position in political liberalism, where he drops the general conception and sought to broaden the appeal of justice's fairness. He argued in political liberalism that instead of being an alternative to utilitarianism, justice's fairness is compatible with certain versions of utilitarianism and other reasonable, comprehensive philosophical, moral, and religious doctrines that would be affirmed by reasonable persons within a well-ordered democratic society. The difference is, in political liberalism, Rawls no longer seeks to provide a theory of justice that applies universally to all societies. But he also does not claim, as Mills assumes, that his conception of justice does not apply to non-democratic societies. Instead, for purposes of political liberalism, he brackets the question of moral truth and whether justice as fairness is universally applicable to all societies, by constructing what he calls a political conception of justice based in fundamental ideas implicit in the political culture of a democratic society. Rawls is not committing himself to relativism, as Mills seems to suggest in claiming that Rawls's principles do not apply to a racist society. Rawls has to reject relativism about justice as part of political liberalism, just as he brackets the question of the nature and possibility of moral truth. Now, Charles Mills surely has to admit that some liberal egalitarian conception of justice is appropriate to apply to what he regards as our fundamentally racist society. Because unlike Marx, his critical predecessor, Mills must assume a non-relativistic objective conception of justice and social equality. Because he said constructing a theory of corrective justice in rectification of a history of racism. He grounds his criticisms of what he calls racial liberalism in a radical liberal ideals, as he says, of the moral equality of free and equal persons. But he doesn't say how these ideals differ from Rawls's ideal of free and equal moral persons. Like Rawls, Mills must assume at some point that a fundamental aspect of his non-ideal theory is a principle of equal basic rights and liberties, substantive equal opportunities for moral persons, and so on. Otherwise, his argument for corrective racial justice has no grounding. Because if justice is relativistic and ideological, then there's nothing to rectify in the transition from the allegedly racist society that Mills claims we are to the more democratic society that both Mills and Rawls aspire to. But relativism can't be Mills's position. The main difference between Mills and Rawls here is not that Mills rejects liberal egalitarian principles of justice. Instead, it's that Mills locates the principles of moral and social equality that he relies on within his non-ideal theory of corrective justice. Whereas for Rawls, a non-ideal theory of transitional justice is grounded in an antecedent ideal theory that sets forth objective requirements of justice for a democratic society. That's simply a methodological difference between Rawls and Mills. It's not the significant moral or political difference that Mills pretends it is. Okay, next section, Rawls' social contract theory is ideal theory. As with ideal theory, Charles Mills also has argued at length against liberal and democratic social contract doctrines. He contends social contract theories are fundamentally flawed because, while advocating the freedom and equality of persons, the major historical advocates, Hobbes, Locke, Rousseau, and Kant, were nonetheless racist, sexist, and white male supremacists. Following the critical method in Rousseau's Second Discourse on Inequality, Mills critically applies social contract doctrine to expose a fraudulent racial contract, as he calls it, which he says is a domination contract that allegedly underlies predominantly white supremacist exploitation and subjugation of racial minorities in Western societies. This critical contractarian analysis of racial injustice is an essential part of a non-ideal theory of corrective justice, Mills claims. Then he turns from critical social contract theory to normative social contract theory to advocate principles of corrective justice that free and equal persons agree to. Rather than rejecting normative social contract doctrine, he instead contends that it must be preceded by an historical analysis of racial injustice that is incorporated into a non-ideal contractarian theory. Now, the critical use of social contract theory is one way, but surely it's not the only way, or even a good way, to provide an historical analysis of racial injustice. Granted that the justification of moral principles must be preceded by an awareness and understanding of historical injustice, surely this does not imply that social contract doctrine is necessary for that purpose, or even helpful. For starting with Frederick Douglass, few, if any, of the major works on racial injustice, other than Mills, pretends to rely on critical social contract theory. But if so, then why must critical social contract analysis of historical injustice be a precondition for normative social contract theory to justify the fundamental principles of justice or the principles of corrective justice that address their infringement? There are too many other more reliable ways to understand the history of racial injustice than by inventing the fiction that white members of society unanimously agree to slavery, to Jim Crow laws, and the continuing history of racial exploitation and subjugation. Moreover, it's questionable whether social contract doctrine is even suitable for analyzing injustice. At least Rousseau's fraudulent social contract depicting the origins of inequality assumed everyone's agreement, including the poor, to submit to a repressive state and to abide by its laws. The fraud consisted in the misinformation that led the poor to agree to be exploited and dominated by the wealthy and powerful. Unlike Rousseau, Mill's racial contract is not a fraudulent social contract made by everyone with everyone else, but it's an exclusionary domination contract among the racially privileged members of society to oppress and subjugate racial minorities who have no part in and do not consent to their domination. So Mill's racial contract does not satisfy the generality, universality, and reciprocity conditions of social contract theory, which require that every member of society be represented and mutually benefit from social cooperation. Nor does the racial contract represent the freedom and moral equality of all persons subject to it, but it's designed to do the opposite, to deny the freedom and equality of those excluded from participation. Far from representing a social contract among all members of society, the purpose of the racial domination contract Mills imagines is to exclude and subjugate a portion of the population and deprive them of their moral status as free and equal moral persons. Now, I've claimed that an essential presupposition of non-ideal theory is ideal theory itself, an account of the fundamental requirements of justice. One cannot pretend to do non-ideal theory without assuming ideal theory, since what makes a theory non-ideal is that it addresses violations of the ideal or fundamental requirements of justice. Mills, however, contends parties in the original position and a well-ordered society require knowledge of history, the history of injustice, before they can agree on the principles of justice. Though ideal theory surely requires a knowledge of history in as many injustices, as I've said, unlike Mills, I think we should assume that the fundamental principles of social and political justice can, and perhaps must be developed independently of theories of corrective justice that presuppose them. I agree with Mills in recognizing that knowledge of a history of racial injustice is relevant to verifying the fundamental principles of ideal theory, because we need to check principles of justice against our considered convictions of justice and of injustice in coming to reflective equilibrium on them. If the principles of ideal theory do not condemn racist institutions and racial practices and prejudices as unjust above all else, as classical utilitarianism doesn't, then it disqualifies them as sound principles of justice. So knowledge of historical and existing injustice is relevant. It's also relevant, as Mill contends, to decide and apply principles of corrective justice and determine appropriate measures of rectification. But unlike Mills, I do not see why this knowledge needs to be incorporated within the ideal theory that corrective justice presupposes. We need knowledge of historical, racial, and other injustices in order to assess the adequacy of an ideal theory of justice, such as Rawls's, and come to a reflective equilibrium on its principles. But this does not imply Mill's position that the artificial parties to the hypothetical social contract, both in the original position and members of a well-ordered society, themselves need knowledge of the history of racial injustice in order to determine the fundamental principles of justice that are necessary for us to judge and assess the extent of these very injustices. This confuses the points of view of hypothetical persons behind a veil of ignorance and as members of a well-ordered society, and what they must know to come to an agreement on fundamental principles of justice, confuses that with our own point of view and what we must know in order to come to reflective equilibrium on these principles. Now I want to address the idea of strict compliance within ideal theory. Rawls's parties in the original position choose and agree to principles for an ideal, well-ordered society, where everyone accepts and regularly complies with the principles of justice. The original position, Rawls says, mirrors the moral features of a well-ordered society and models free and equal citizens' general acceptance of principles that govern a well-ordered society. It's characteristic of normative social contract doctrine to regard the parties to the social contract as agreeing to principles that free and equal moral persons all reasonably and rationally can accept and commit themselves to as members of society. Ideal theory, with the assumption of general acceptance and strict compliance, is then built into the structure of liberal and democratic social contract theories. Now, these theoretical ideas, general acceptance and strict compliance, they have parallels in other areas in moral and political philosophy. Kant's categorical imperative and its formula of universal law and a kingdom of ends, those are ideal theory. We should act only on laws that rational beings all could rationally will and comply with as if by a law of nature, and also in an ideal social world where all are motivated by a good will. Also, rule utilitarians have interpreted Kant's categorical imperative as a universalizability requirement that tests the validity of social rules by asking us to imagine the consequences of everyone's full compliance with them. This too is ideal theory in the sense of an assumption of strict compliance to determine the moral principles that apply to us here and now. Now, many critics of Rawls, including Mills, claim that because the parties in the original position choose principles of justice for an ideal society that is assumed to, where they're assumed to strictly comply with these principles, that because of this, these principles can apply to our own society. But that simply misunderstands the role of strict compliance in the hypothetical construct of a well-ordered society. Like the original position, they are an integral part of a philosophical thought experiment that's designed to discover and justify what justice requires in our own society. The very point of engaging in this hypothetical inquiry in ideal theory is to discover principles of justice that apply to our non-ideal society, and indeed to any society, including racist societies, in order to discover the nature and the extent of the injustices that actually exist in unjust societies. Simply because the parties in the original position agree to principles that free and equal moral persons will accept and comply with in an ideal society cannot mean these principles cannot apply to our own society. What would be the point of conjecturing principles that artificial people can agree to and comply with if they don't apply to our unjust society? That's the way Rawls and everyone else, including Mills, understood justice as fairness for over 40 years. It was only once Mills and other critical philosophers such as Amartya Sen and Jerry Gauss and others noticed that the artificial parties in the original position are choosing principles not for their own non-ideal society, but for an ideal society of which they're members and where everyone agrees on justice, that anyone began to question the application of Rawls's principles to our own society. Critics then made the mistaken argument that because these artificial people are choosing principles for an ideal society, that somehow these principles cannot apply to us. But this is an implicit rejection, not just of social contract doctrine, but of Kant and Kantian doctrines, rule consequentialism, and other attempts to address the fundamental questions in moral philosophy by assuming universal compliance. Now, it's true that from the point of view of the parties in the original position, the principles are intended to apply to a well-ordered society where these principles are fully complied with. But again, it's important not to confuse the point of view of artificial persons in the original position and a well-ordered society and what they are trying to achieve from our own point of view as actual members of a democratic society and what we are trying to achieve in engaging in this thought experiment. From the point of view of you and me now, who are assessing the correctness of a conception of justice, the purpose of ideal theory is to enable us to come to a reflective equilibrium on the most appropriate conception of justice for any democratic society in non-ideal circumstances, no matter how racist and unjust. Okay, the last section on the relationship of ideal to non-ideal theory. Earlier, I said that what makes non-ideal theory non-ideal is that it addresses violation of the principles of ideal theory. Just as what makes a society unjust is that it violates the fundamental principles and requirements of justice. Mills contends that non-ideal theory is needed to apply principles of justice to existing societies that are unjust. But non-ideal theory is not needed to apply Rawls's principles of justice to determine injustices existing in actual societies. Justice as fairness can be directly applied without the mediation of non-ideal theory to identify and criticize a society's injustices and its members' violation of their moral duties and obligations. Injustice is readily apparent simply by comparing historical circumstances with the principles and requirements of justice. There's no uncertainty about the fact that the historical denial of the right to vote to women and African Americans violates the equal rights of political participation in Rawls's first principle. Likewise, the denial of rights of racial minorities to compete for occupational and other social positions violates freedom of occupation and fair equal opportunities. President Trump's proposed stopping food stamps and Medicaid to millions of citizens clearly violates the adequate social minimum guaranteed by Rawls's principles. And finally, it's obvious that historical and continuous racism perpetuates countless injustices that violate each and every one of Rawls's principles of justice, as well as the natural duties of justice, mutual respect, and obligations of fairness. We know this just by comparing racist institutions, racist practices, and actions with Rawls's principles, duties, and obligations of justice. It's the primary role of ideal theory to identify and guide criticism of injustices in non-ideal circumstances, and then provide a basis for reform. Rawls says, quote, injustices are identified by the extent of the deviation from perfect justice. Also, he says, existing institutions are to be judged in the light of this conception and held to be unjust to the extent that they depart from it without sufficient reason. Non-ideal theory is not needed to identify injustices and the extent of injustice. Well, if non-ideal theory is not needed to identify, criticize, or assess the degree of racial and other injustices, then what is its role? Non-ideal theory addresses injustices that are identified by ideal theory by providing principles designed to remove, reform, and rectify existing and past injustices and compensate for past wrongs. It consists of principles of reform, transition, compensation, and other forms of rectification of the injustices that arise from violating the fundamental principles of ideal theory that determine when injustices occur. We do not need non-ideal theory to say an injustice has been done, nor its extent. Nor do we need non-ideal theory to tell us to cease doing injustice. Instead, non-ideal theory plays an essential role in addressing the rectification and reform of justice. But even then, ideal theory has a crucial practical role in shaping non-ideal theory. Contrary to Mills, non-ideal theory is not a separate inquiry from ideal theory. In engaging in non-ideal theory, we don't leave ideal theory behind. Rawls says, quote, ideal theory is the fundamental part of the theory of justice and essential for the non-ideal part as well. In addition to identifying and critically assessing injustice and its extent, there are at least three further ways Rawls's ideal conception is essential to non-ideal theory. First, ideal theory guides the cessation, removal, and prevention of existing injustice. Rawls says we have a natural duty to remove any injustices, starting with the most grievous. This natural duty especially applies to governments and their officials in the exercise of their political authority. The principles and requirements of justice of ideal theory both identify injustices to be removed and require government to cease enforcement of and eliminate unjust laws and practices. Also, the ideal conception provides non-ideal theory with the moral constraints on and prevention of any further enactment or enforcement of new laws and public policies that are unjust. Charles Mills proposes three principles of corrective racial justice: to end racially unjust citizenship, to end racial exploitation, and to end racial disrespect. Well, these principles reflect these requirements of Rawls's principles of justice, and they immediately follow from the application of justice as fairness to racially unjust societies. The second way that ideal theory applies to non-ideal theory is in the reform and transition to just institutions. In addition to the ceasing and removal of injustice, the natural duty of justice requires societies to reform existing institutions in the direction of a more just society. So Rawls says, an ideal conception of the social order is set up, which is to regulate the direction of change and efforts of reform. The principles of justice, he continues, belong to ideal theory and set up an aim to guide the course of social reform. In this way, quote, ideal theory is a necessary complement to non-ideal theory, without which the desire for change lacks an aim. So the principles, requirements, and concepts of ideal theory provide grounds for the reform of injustices and for the transition to a situation where principles of justice are better realized within institutions, laws, and practices. Rawls further says ideal theory provides a just conception of just society we are to achieve if we can, or at least work toward, generally in gradual steps. I mean, here's a quote, which I'm going to skip over just in the interest of time. The natural duty to promote justice is not a consequentialist duty to take the most effective means to restore and reform unjust institutions. Transitional measures are constrained by the principles of justice and their priority rules, especially the non-violation of equal basic rights and liberties and the natural duties, which with few exceptions apply to non-ideal circumstances. But requirements of the second principle's fair equality of opportunity and the difference principle are more flexible, and their requirements vary in non-ideal circumstances, depending on the degree of injustice of institutions to which they're to be applied and the likelihood of success in applying them. For example, in order to guarantee fair opportunities for people of color against a background of enduring racial injustice and its effects, preferential treatment may be required. Mills disagrees and argues that because preferential treatment's unjust in a well-ordered society, it can't be permissible in non-ideal conditions either. But this misunderstands the application of principles of justice to non-ideal circumstances, which is not fixed by the laws that hold in a well-ordered society. There's a widespread misunderstanding of the role of the idea of a well-ordered society, which you see also in Amartya Sen and Gauss and others who criticize Rawls's ideal theory. The role of a well-ordered society is mainly to justify the principles of justice. Its role is not to determine the application of principles of justice to non-ideal circumstances. I believe is a well-ordered society even to be used as a state of affairs that guides the application of principles of justice to reform unjust societies. So the requirements of fair equal opportunity under non-ideal conditions differs from its requirements in ideal conditions of a well-ordered society. Preferential treatment, then, can be one of several necessary transitional means of reform required to give fair, equal opportunities to racial minorities in non-ideal conditions. Another example of justice in transition is the application of Rawls's difference principle applied to non-ideal circumstances, which requires not simply reducing inequality and improving the position of the least advantaged, but also that society enact measures that put into place an economic system in which the least advantaged are better off than any other economic system. Rawls says this is either property-owned democracy or liberal socialism. Well, in order to transition to a just economic system, society must enact measures, including redistribution of economic wealth and economic powers of ownership and control of means of production that temporarily have the effect of lowering aggregate wealth in society and perhaps even everyone's standard of living, including the least advantaged. Well, these measures are not maximally beneficial to the least advantaged in the short run, and they may even make them worse off temporarily. But they're permissible because they're necessary measures that maximally benefit the same members of society of the least advantaged class eventually. That's the unavoidable cost of transition. The general point is that rather than ideal and non-ideal theory being two separate theories addressing different questions, as Mill maintains, ideal theory and its principles of justice are indispensable to determining non-ideal theories of reform and transition to a more just laws and institutions. The principles, duties, and values of ideal theory are incorporated as an essential ingredient of non-ideal theories of prevention, reform, and transition. Finally, the third way ideal theory is essential to non-ideal theory is in setting forth the terms of corrective and compensatory injustice, including retributive justice and the theory of punishment, compensatory injustice to address civil wrongs and the law of tort, contract and property, civil disobedience, militant resistance, and just war theory, all of which Rawls mentions in a theory of justice. In the restatement, Rawls also mentions addressing problems of discrimination based on race and gender and the measures needed to secure equality of women and minorities. Now, Rawls does not say much in theory of justice about corrective principles that apply in non-ideal circumstances, other than this 4 sections on civil disobedience and conscientious refusal. But clearly he envisioned the use of the original position and the 4-stage sequence to work out the terms of the principles of non-ideal theory. So he says non-ideal theory is worked out after an ideal conception have been chosen. Only then do the parties ask which principles to adopt under less happy conditions. So Rawls envisioned the use of the original position by the parties in the original position to determine the principles of non-ideal theory. So Mills has good grounds for suggesting that a revised original position be used for a non-ideal theory to work out terms of corrective justice. Whereas he idealizes parties in Rawls's original position such that they have no knowledge of his, whereas the idealized parties in Rawls's original position have no knowledge of historical injustice in coming to a determination of the principle of justice. In applying this ideal conception, the principles of justice, to non-ideal condition, the parties do have in the original position factual knowledge of the injustices that they address. But Rawls's framework already has a way to accommodate the theory of corrective racial injustice that Mills is imagining. Once the principles of justice are in place, the appropriate way to understand principles and other requirements of corrective injustice is that they should be decided at the constitutional and legislative stages of the 4-stage sequence, which are to be impartially applied with full knowledge of relevant facts of injustice at the 4th stage, a judicial stage. So Mills' own proposed non-ideal theory of corrective justice, determined behind a veil of ignorance, is not all that dissimilar from Rawls's suggestion. Mills, in the end, turns out to be a Rawlsian revisionist. Finally, to conclude, Mills chastises Rawls for failing to address racial justice, which he defines narrowly as principles of corrective racial justice, including reparations. He contends this should have been the first item of business on Rawls's agenda, not an afterthought or simply ignored. It would indeed have been very helpful to know what Rawls might have said about corrective racial injustice and reparations, including any substantive principles he might have proposed. But I've argued that for Rawls, a non-ideal theory of corrective justice and reparations cannot be the first order of business, since they require prior fundamental principles of justice, which specify and identify basic rights and liberties, fair equal opportunities, a fair social minimum, natural duties and moral obligations that have all been violated by a history of racial injustice. A theory of corrective justice, including Mills' own proposed theory, has no content without fundamental principles of justice that identify the violations of justice standing in need of correction and their magnitude. Thank you. Okay.
Thank you very much, Professor, for a very, very, very clear.
Sorry, I went on a little long.
We have the questions that we gave you already by email, but we have here Julia and Ulysses. I'm sorry, and I'm sorry, the name completely Is it Lucas? I'm sorry, Lucas, forgot your name. So is either Julia or Lucas who will begin the questioning? Julia, would you like to begin?
Yes, thank you, Professor Daniel. Thank you so much, Professor Freeman. It's a great pleasure and honor to be here in this talk with you. I think before we start, first of all, I'd like to share with all that I actually sent like about 5 comments for Professor Freeman, and I will not go through all of them because we have other people that we want to talk. So I'll just choose 2. And then if it's the case, we can come back to the other ones. But first, I would just like also to situate Professor Freeman a little bit in Brazil right now, just because we have just November was a month that we call the Black Conscious Month because of racism in Brazil. So I think that it's also very fortunate for us to be discussing the potentials and how can, from a theory of justice, how can Rawls's work help us out in thinking of racism and the possibilities of equality. And also here in Brazil, we have affirmative action, and our Supreme Court, the decision for the constitutionality of the affirmative action in the universities begins with Rawls. So actually Rawls has been very influential here in Brazil. And so, I mean, just some brief. Anyways, so I asked some, like I said, I had some questions for Professor Freeman. As a person who studies Rawls in general, I agree, actually, your studies have been very important for my interpretation on the congruence and how can we understand the shift from the theory of justice to liberal, to political liberalism. So I just have like, so I'll just choose 2 questions that I think that for me at least will help me out, and I think that relate to your paper. So the second one, so for everybody, I asked Professor Freeman that there is a definition in his paper where he says, when you say, when his paper says that what makes a racist society unjust is that it violates the foundational principles and requirements affirmed by ideal theories of justice. In the case, Rawls' Justice of Fairness on page 5. Is it possible to think that this theory, the theory of justice, has also the potential to criticize all aspects of racism in society? One could think, for example, of the symbolic and cultural spaces that racism is entrenched. Mass media, patterns of what constitutes as beautiful as desired or as repellent and dangerous. A Black man in a racist society will probably be still considered dangerous, or other stereotypes that are constitutive of racist structures. What resources do we have in Justice as Fairness to tackle such issues? Or from what I understood, this is already the task to be done by non-ideal theory, but already considering that ideal theory is part of the, this is one of the questions. But the second one that I asked for Professor Freeman is then it's all about restatement, because sometimes from your paper, I found that you said something like, oh, this was not Rawls's final say in that, and locating Rawls's theory on theory of justice and much more. And so here I asked the place of restatement in understanding and assessing Rawls's theory. I'd like to hear you out a little bit of that, because this restatement, I know that it's being a body of work that's being studied a lot by Rawlsians to try to still connect like incoherences or other intuitions that we can get from Rawls's work. And I think that wouldn't it be interesting to locate in the Justice as Fairness other parts where we can see that Rawls locates from an egalitarian point of view. the wrongs of inequality, for example, like he says, some of Rawls's ideas, such as his section on 39, he says that the wrongs of inequality, they show us how audience are fixed status set by birth, gender, or race. So I would just like to hear you out a little bit on this as well. If it's not interesting for us to look in the restatement many other times that we can find textually arguments that go against, or that can show maybe that Charles Mills' reading of this part of Rawls's work maybe missed out on some issues. And I'm also thinking there's a footnote that I don't remember which one, that he says about it could happen that if we analyze the United States, it's only democratic formally. There's a part in the statement that Rawls also puts that. So I think that it's such a rich body of work.
Yeah.
A theory. So I'd just like to hear you out on these two questions initially. Okay, thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you, Joe. Those are very good questions. Thank you, Joe. I mean, you had several other good questions too. So the first one you mentioned, which was the second question, I mean, is it possible to think that Rawls's theory has potential to criticize all aspects of racism in society? I mean, I didn't mention this here, but as you know, if you read the whole paper, at the end of my paper, the final section, I discuss the natural duties and moral obligations of fairness that Rawls discusses in I think there are 8 sections really in Theory of Justice. So among the natural duties of the duties of justice, duties not to be agents of injustice, duties of mutual respect, mutual aid, duties not to harm others or do violence to them, duties to treat people fairly and impartially and with due consideration. And I specifically brought those up because they haven't been discussed much at all in the literature on Rawls, which is sort of extraordinary because there have been over 10,000 articles written on Rawls, and there's very little said about these. And so I actually taught a course on Kant's moral philosophy last semester because I knew that's where he'd gotten these. And in the Metaphysics of Ethics and so on, Kant goes over these various, what Rawls calls natural duties. And they're actually, the way Kant discusses them, they're actually quite rich. They can do a lot of work, I think, in addressing non-institutional social practices and norms and conventions. Like you mentioned mass media, for instance, so the sort of subtle racism that's implicit in mass media as to what constitutes a beautiful person, right? And I think that there's a foundation for discussing these within Rawls's theory. The way you're going to have to address them is with moral duties of individuals or moral duties of associations, like employment, like universities or churches or businesses, right? They have these moral duties which to address racist actions that don't violate people's rights. I mean, that's what we're dealing with here, right? So the criticism of Rawls is, well, he only addresses the basic structure. And he tells everybody what their basic rights and liberties are, and that they should be equal and so on. But, I mean, that's great. That's legal protections, but most of the moral wrongs that constitute racism are not violations of people's rights anymore. I mean, we dealt with that, by 1966, we dealt with it, we got rid of Jim Crow laws and all the violation of people's rights. You could have complete respect for people's rights and liberties under Rawls's principles of justice, but still there'd be rampant racism just in the way people interact, right? So I think that there are these resources in Rawls that need to be developed, and it'd be great if someone wrote more on them. Right. I mean, I think that's where you have to start. I think any theory, I mean, this is a big topic of discussion now about systemic racism being really a matter of practices and conventions and, you know, public culture are not really a matter of racist laws anyway. We've sort of got beyond that. And I think that's right. I mean, it's a very important, and of course, Rawls could have said more about it, right? I mean, he wasn't as attuned to the kind of racism implicit in culture and norms as we might be, because back when he was writing this, the legal injustices, the inequalities in the basic structure were still just rampant. You know, I mean, whites would just refuse to serve blacks if they came into a restaurant, right? And that's what he was addressing, those kinds of injustices. So I think you're right. A lot more could be said about it. And I think there's a lot, but I think there's a lot in Rawls's theory of justice to address those kinds of issues. But of course, you know, you need to say a lot more. You need to develop this account of natural duties and obligations to people that we have to treat people with respect, not treat them with contempt, not ignore them because of their racial, religious, or whatever, or sexual preferences. I mean, those are matters of moral philosophy, you might say. And you might say, I mean, that's the next frontier, I guess, in moral philosophy is to come up with a more developed theory to address those kinds of wrongs. They're not injustices and they don't violate people's rights, but they're great moral wrongs. And yeah, I think there's a foundation for that in Rawls, right? Whether it's adequate or not, you know, I think we'll have to see. We'll have to wait and see how that develops in moral philosophy. But that's a very good point. I think you make a very good point. The second point, yeah, where I say that Mills took the two sentences out of Rawls's restatement and said, well, this is Rawls's final position. So we can assume that this is what he meant, that his theory of justice didn't apply to racist societies, right? As I said, I mean, I said in the longer version, I didn't say it here. These were Rawls's lecture notes. It's extraordinary. These were his lectures. He never intended to publish them. They were completed in 1989, 1990 when he last taught this course. So they were not the last thing he wrote. Political liberalism came after that, you know, another 10 years of work. But of course, so the point was simply that, look, Rawls said something that might appear inconsistent, but this was just, you know, you take two phrases, 7 pages apart, and you know, you're going to find there's this minor inconsistency. Sure, if he'd had the opportunity to work on this and publish it, rather than just leaving as it was, when he had no intention to publish it when he died, then he would probably have corrected that claim that Charles Mills relies on, which makes it seem like Rawls is saying my theory doesn't apply to racist societies. I don't think that's what he meant at all, because there's so much else that he said and everything else he did where it was clear that his theory applied to racist societies. I think you're certainly right. There's a lot in the restatement that, particularly with respect to the application of the difference principle. You know, I mean, Rawls hadn't written really on the difference principle in 20 years. And there's just a lot in there about property owning, democracy, and liberal socialism, and so on, that is quite relevant and is quite, and it's very important. I didn't, when I said that it wasn't the last thing he published, I didn't mean that to diminish the importance of the new work that he did in the restatement. Does that make sense? Okay, good. All right, but thank you for your very detailed questions. I mean, you have 2 pages single spaced of questions, and I'll write you back on the others. Yeah. So thank you.
Thank you, Julie, for the questions, and Professor Freeman for the answers. We have Lucas Petroni now.
Hi, everybody. Are you listening to me? Is it everything all right with my phone? Okay, good. So thank you very much, Daniel, and of course Samuel Freeman for the talk and the paper. It goes without saying that I profit a lot from your work on Rawls. So this is an honor for me. I actually had one big question, so I'll just try to summarize it here about the role of ideologies in the kind of normative or ideal normative theories in general, and if you think it's an important subject or not, because this is partially, I don't know, to my mind, this is what I think critical theorists are worried about. They're worried about like false consciousness and justificatory narratives more than actually good faith normative arguments in general. So I would love to hear on this subject. And I would start saying that it seems totally true to me that Chris Mills and many other critical theorists most of the time seem to be trading in the art of what you marvelously labeled in the paper the principle of uncharitable reading of liberal authors. So I think that most of their jobs is engaged in this kind of practice, and Rawls being one of the main targets, of course. And it's also plausible to say that most of the philosophical work on this kind of argument or immanent criticism of liberalism relies on ad hominem assumptions on the intellectual limits, or sometimes the characterizers, or even the lack of intellectual virtues, or actually the intellectual vices of liberal thinkers. Because, of course, how come didn't liberals realize how racially, gendered, and economically unequal their societies actually were when they are like writing those beautiful, well-ordered worlds and perfect arguments? So this kind of hypocrisy charge is everywhere there. So I totally agree with you, but I would like to explore a different route here, something that your paper made me think of. Let's call it the charitable reading of the uncharitable reading. What if liberal theories, like Rawls' own theory, but all the other liberal theorists, rather than the theories themselves, haven't paid enough attention to these kinds of justificatory practices or justificatory narratives that are very common in non-ideal circumstances? Sorry. Justificatory narratives of asymmetric power, marginalization, and discrimination. For instance, self-justificatory racialized narratives, according to which some groups aren't hardworking enough and therefore shouldn't count in the distribution of the benefits of social cooperation, or maybe that is simply too dangerous to try to put some economic or some democratic control on private wealth, or maybe all the kinds of justificatory narratives that we can find, for instance, in the last book of Thomas Piketty, Capital and Ideology, where he shows how liberalism can work as this kind of ideology or narrative of justificatory narratives for inequalities, especially in post-communist world. So this kind of thing that I have in mind here. And it's certainly true that in our partially or maybe somewhat just societies that we live in, we have dozens of these narratives all the time in the media, in the universities, in the church, and the public space in general. And these kinds of ideologies help to sustain deeply entrenched injustice. I think this is it's a trivial point. And I think this is the kind of thing that maybe Chris Mills has in mind or had in mind when he was so worried about liberalism or the true history of liberalism. Let's reveal the hypocrisy. Let's change these kinds of narratives. So I think that Rawls is completely aware. Maybe this is my supposition, at least, that Rawls is completely aware of this fact, because he mentions the possibility of some sorts of justice or conceptions of justice being cooptated, and I quote here, as a defense of an unjust and unworthy status quo, and thus being ideological in Marx's sense, in justice as fairness. And when he discusses the requirements of a well-ordered society, he imagines something like a society without any kinds of ideology in the bad sense. So I quote again, the hope is that a well-ordered society in which the full publicity condition is satisfied, it's related with the requirement of full publicity, that is, where all the three levels of publicity are achieved, is a society without ideology, understood in Marx's sense of false consciousness, or the pejorative sense of ideology. Mm-hmm. My question then is, what is the place of ideology criticism in Rawlsian philosophy or in liberal philosophy in general? How could we use idealized conception of justice to dispel such inegalitarian narratives or justificatory narratives? My guess here is that it's related with the fourth role of philosophy for Rawls, showing how another world is possible, or extending the possibilities of our expectations, or the normative horizons of our world. So I think this maybe could be the role, but I'm curious to hear you about some different take on this subject of ideologies. Thank you very much, Professor.
Good, that's great. Yeah, thank you, Lucas. Yeah, that's a great question. I think Rawls was very aware of the rationalizations, the ideologies that are built around the liberal values, liberal and democratic values of freedom and equality and equal opportunity, and rewarding people according to their desert or their contribution. And all of that is, as Marx argued, is really just ideological given the way that it's applied. These liberal concepts, they're just ideological given the way they're implied, right? They seem right, but nonetheless, look at how they're used, even by a lot of the great liberal thinkers like Hayek, or certainly libertarians, or and so on. So he was very aware of that, and very aware of the dangers of fundamental democratic and liberal values being used as rationalizations for injustice. And that's the problem, right? And that's the role that critical theory can play, is exposing the illusions, exposing that these theories or these arguments or these claims made in Congress or whatever, or legislatures by politicians, they're not intentional rationalizations. I mean, but people sincerely believe these, but they basically hide obscure injustice, right? And critical theory has a very important role in doing that and exposing that. And I agree with that completely. What I'm resisting is that the view which held by some critical theorists, and maybe by Marx at one point in his career, that all talk about justice and equal rights and equal opportunities, that those concepts are just ideological all the way down, that they express some kind of fundamental false beliefs that are rationalizations. What Rawls was trying to do, you're right, he was trying to develop these fundamental sort of liberal democratic ideals, freedom and equality and equal opportunity and economic reciprocity and so on, trying to organize them and give an interpretation of them that would survive the ideological critique, that was not ideological, that could serve as a public basis for justification in this ideal society, right? So what you're saying is absolutely right. The point is, we're stuck with we're going to have ideological consciousness And it's always going to be with us, right? Some people are going to have illusions, but he was trying to describe a social world in which it would be absent, because he was trying to locate a conception of justice which would not require epistemic injustice, right? I mean, that's what Charles Mills was good at. He's saying, look, I mean, we're just surrounded by epistemic injustice. We're surrounded by ideology is just a kind of epistemic. The idea of saying it's an injustice is sort of an extension of the idea of ideology. So he was trying to come up with the conception of justice that free and equal persons could live with and all accept and organize their social life according to, which did not require false beliefs about their social relations. I mean, he was very much moved by and trying to respond to Marx. I mean, that's what, if you look at Rawls's, I mean, you probably have Rawls's lectures on Marx. He was very concerned with addressing Marx's condemnation of the justice, the idea of justice. And he said, no, there must be some conception of justice that is non-ideological, that doesn't have, and that's what he was trying to do, I think. I mean, it's good, it's not talked about much, but you're right to emphasize it. I think, you know, my sense is what Charles Mills accepted basically a very something like Rawls's theory of justice. I think Piketty does too, right? I mean, he basically accepts the difference. He said in the last chapter of the book you mentioned, he Capital and Ideology, well, yes, he accepts Rawls' difference principle, but he doesn't quite understand it. And look what Hayek says he accepts it too, so blah, blah, blah. But I mean, Rawls has really got something, you know, if you have people on the left coming out of a Marxist tradition, or people like Reiner Forst or Habermas, right? There's not any fundamental disagreement between these left liberal egalitarians. I mean, maybe there's disagreement with Jerry Cohen and about difference principle versus Luck egalitarianism, but that's just kind of, you know, that's not sort of fundamental disagreement. They accept the egalitarianism. Rawls got it. He at least got one way to look at it at a social basis for fundamental principles to organize society that didn't require an ideology. Maybe there are other ones, but right, I think that's what he was trying to do, and I think he came close to doing it, you know. And what I object to are the people who say, well, it's still ideological. I don't think that Charles Mills is saying it's ideological, right? But other critical theorists do, I think. And I'd say, well, what is not, I mean, give me an example of what would be non-ideological on your account. And they never really offer anything positive. That's the problem. They never propose anything positive. And they have arguments with that. We can't discover it now because we're so, you know, we're so deluded by this and so on. But in any case, that's my only objection to critical theorists, and it's not true of all of them. I don't even think it's true of Charles Mills, is that they would object Rawls's conception of justice as itself being ideological. And I just don't see, I mean, you got to make some argument for that, right? And I don't see the argument. Yeah. So that's a great point though. Yeah. I'm not rejecting all critical. I think it's great. You know, I read a lot of Adorno. I read a lot of that stuff. Yeah. Habermas, I taught Habermas and so on. So I don't, you're right. I think there's a lot. And the stuff about epistemic injustice, it's quite true, you know, in many cases. Yeah. That in contemporary circumstances, right? I just don't think Rawls is epistemic injustice. That's so, yeah. Is that? Thanks. Yeah.
So I'm looking if we have one more question here. I actually would like to ask one question. I'm a little afraid of spoiling the discussion since everything's going so well, but there are two things that I would like to ask you about. One is like when you said that you think that Charles Mills accepts Rawls' principles of justice. There's one thing I wonder, especially about the different principle. You know his work a lot better than I do, but do you think that he would rather have the difference principle than the reparations principle? the principle of reparations? I mean, you think he would agree that the difference principle is superior to the reparations principle, the principle of reparations, I'm sorry.
Well, they operate at different levels. The difference principle is a much more general principle. It's a principle about how you're going to organize the economy in a liberal and democratic society, right? How we're going to determine who owns and controls the means of production, right? In other words, the difference principle is not just a principle of distributed justice. It's not just a principle to say, well, given any outcome, economic outcome, we should take it and distribute it so that it maximizes the position of the least advantage. It's a principle for organizing social and economic systems. And if that's the case, I don't think it conflicts at all with any principle of reparations. In fact, you require some account of what economic justice is before you can fully work out an account of reparations. Because part of the argument is that, we have generations, hundreds of years of African Americans whose labor has just been, they've been enslaved. Their labor, the products of their labor has been stolen. The products of their labor has been stolen, and they've been done this great injustice. So they deserve some kind of compensation. Well, in order to decide what that compensation's got to be, you have to have an account of economic justice and how much what they would have earned, you might say, in a just and fair economy. So I don't see them as conflicting. I think Charles basically saw the difference principle in this kind of narrow way as just a principle for distributing income and wealth. And if you think of it that way, it does conflict with the principle of reparations. Or he would say the principle of reparations should have priority. That in fact, we're going to have to make the least advantage even worse off than they already are in order to compensate generations of African Americans for their injustice. That's how I think he thought of it. But that's not the way that I think it's a narrow reading of the difference principle. And I don't think, my view is the two can be made compatible. Yeah. And even that reparations presupposes the difference. Just like I've argued the whole paper, that any theory of corrective justice presupposes an account of the fundamental principles of justice. And that's not just basic rights and liberties and equal opportunity, but also economic justice. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
So I'm trying to agree with Charles, right? Bless his soul. I'm trying to agree with him. He's right. It's just that he's criticizing his allies. That's what he's doing. That's what I don't understand. Why would you attack your major ally, or someone whose view is totally compatible with what you're trying to do? Yeah.
Right, okay. I can see that. Maybe I wasn't clear, but you think they're compatible, and that maybe, I don't know, maybe Charles thought he didn't go far enough, but I completely see your point that both principles are compatible and that the difference principle.
Yeah. I mean, Charles was an old Marxist, so he might have argued for some kind of socialism, right? And whether he would have accepted liberal socialism, I don't know. I mean, you had, whether he would accept Rawls's version of liberal socialism or a more non-liberal version of socialism, I don't know. I mean, I imagine this is not in his written work, so I don't know what. But otherwise, I didn't see any fundamental disagreement with Rawls's view of economic justice, where you interpret the difference principle as applying not just to distribution, but to structure an economic system, right? Who owns and controls the means of production, right? You need some standard for determining that, and Rawls gives it to you. That's why the difference principle is so powerful in some ways. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. Do we have any more questions? Looking just before.
Ulysses had a question, but I think, is Ulysses here?
Yes, I'm here.
He sent me a question. Yeah.
Well, can I pose the question now, Daniel?
Sure.
Yeah. Go ahead.
Okay. Well, thank you, Professor Daniel, and thank you, Professor Freeman, for the wonderful lecture. I'm saying I'm learning a lot this afternoon with all this discussion. So I have my question. I suppose it's similar to Julia's. Well, you argue that the natural duties and obligations among individuals would also play an important role in overcoming racism. And my question is, as for these notions of natural obligations and duties, I don't see how they can have an institutional implications, an institutional role for the basic structure of society. So perhaps they can be thought in light of some kind of a public liberal education, some kind of educational policy. But this kind of proposal would not conceive justice as fairness as a comprehensive doctrine. And I also have a short question. Once Daniel brings the question of a principle of reparation, I also want to know if a principle of reparation should be thought within the scope of a non-ideal theory to overcome racial injustice, or it should be incorporated in the ideal theory framework, maybe as a part of a social minimum or something like that. That will be good.
That's nice.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. Yeah, so would you say the natural duties and obligations, which I talked about in answering Julia, you say, I don't see how they can have institutional implications for the basic structure. Now, why? As I understand it, you seem to argue that they presuppose a comprehensive philosophical doctrine. So like I mentioned, Kant, like Rawls' account of natural duties is influenced by Kant. And clearly Kant's a comprehensive philosophical doctrine, if anybody is, right? Categorical, imperative, and all that. The way he thought of it, the way he argued for the natural duties and political obligations of fairness and so on, is that he thought that they were necessary in order to make the principles of justice effective. In other words, we have principles for institutions, how to structure the Constitution and the economy, and social equality and all that, what people's rights are. But then you have to get people to act in those ways, to respect those institutions and respect other people's rights. So that's why he brings in, and then you have to show the society stable. So of course, people have a duty of justice, a moral duty of justice. That's necessary to make the basic structure feasible. And also you have a duty of mutual respect, because if people are going to live together in harmony and all agree on the same fundamental principles, they have to respect one another as equal citizens and not hold one another in contempt and so on. So he saw the natural duties and duties of fairness as kind of instrumental to making the whole basic structure possible, feasible, to making a well-ordered society feasible. Unless everyone, in other words, you had a society where everyone accepted the principles of justice and the basic structure, but they didn't think they had any moral duty to comply with them, it would be very unstable. It wouldn't exist. It couldn't exist. So in that way, I think he thought that, yeah, there has to be some non-comprehensive doctrine, non-comprehensive public political conception of what our moral duties, individual moral duties are to one another with respect to complying with just laws, respecting people as equals, being impartial and fair in our dealings with people in order to make justice possible, right? That's what he's concerned. That's why the well-ordered society is so important. He's trying to show us how this ideal of justice can be realized in the real world, right? And so you got to have some account of what people's individual moral duties are, right? And he's going to say that, no, you don't. I mean, all the moral, utilitarianism, Kantianism, rational intuitionism, Nozick, all of them agree on these moral duties. I mean, how could you deny we don't have a moral duty to respect somebody as an equal, right? So I think the idea is that, well, there can be an overlapping consensus on this conception of moral duties and duties of fairness in a well-ordered society, and people don't have to have this one particular comprehensive view in order to accept them. I think that's how he thought it, and I think that's probably right. Yeah. Does that sort of respond to the question?
Oh, sure, definitely.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
And then about reparations being part of the ideal theory framework rather than non-ideal theory framework. Well, I mean, in a way, that's what Charles Mills is doing. But, well, and he wants to say it's non-ideal theory all the way. Well, you should make the ideal theory part of the non-ideal theory, is his view. I don't know. Can you say that reparations are part of ideal theory? I mean, they presuppose that the principles of ideal theory have been violated. They presuppose injustice. So what's ideal about injustice, right? I mean, Rawls thought, like the passage I read, or the passage I put up on the PowerPoint, he talked as if, well, once the parties in the original possession have chosen the principles of justice and the natural duties and so on, then they can turn to questions of corrective justice, right? I mean, it's in one of the passages I read. Then they can acquire knowledge of the injustices in the past and develop a theory of corrective justice, or develop a theory of reparations. I think that's already in Rawls. At the constitutional legislative stages in the 4-stage sequence, they get more and more information about the injustices that they have to confront. So they come up with principles to address them, and which can be applied at the judicial stage to determine how much reparations are due to people given, the past history. So I think it's already built into the view. And if you have to look around in Rawls for these passages, I mean, I did all the indices, I did all the indexes for these books, so I know where everything is. The revised version of Theory of Justice. I did that index all over again. I had to look at it and I had to find the corresponding passages. So I know where everything is. And also I did the index for the collected papers. I did the index for Law of Peoples. I did the index for the lectures in the history of political philosophy. So that's one thing. It's probably the best thing ever happened to him was Jack Rawls asking me to do the indices for those books, because I can find things. I mean, now, you really just need a word. You can find things anyway if you get, on Kindle or something. Just have a finder, so it's not. But in any case, yeah. Charles just should have been more careful looking up these ideal theory. So you look at every occurrence of ideal theory and see what he says. He says these things. So yeah, or non-ideal theory. Yeah. So it's good.
Excellent. Thank you very much.
Yes, sir. Thank you.
I guess now we're through the questions, unless Lucas and Julia would like to add something. No? Okay.
So did you have Bill Edmonston talk? Did Bill talk?
Not yet.
Not yet. Oh, good. He's a good.
He's coming. I love it. Since you mentioned another name, I read your paper. I was very curious about Daniel Fryer's work, which you mentioned in the notes.
Daniel. Yeah, he's my graduate student. He's finishing his dissertation. Yeah, but he's already a professor of law at University of Michigan. Yeah,
exactly.
Yeah. So talking with him, that's when I started a reading group on all Charles Mills' work about 2 or 3 years ago, because of Daniel, and he's working on Mills, he's working on reparations. So he's influenced me a lot on this. Yeah, just Yeah, so hopefully I think he may have a paper on Mills and Rawls coming out soon. I'm not sure. Yeah, but he needs to finish his dissertation. He's got to start teaching next semester. So.
Yeah, that's nice. A lot of experience on the bench too. I mean, juridical experience. Very, very impressive.
Yeah, good.
Didn't know him. Anyway.
Yeah, he's a really nice guy. He's a really nice guy.
Yeah, we'll invite him
he
to
just
come
had a baby. His wife just had a baby.
Oh.
So yeah, he's staying up a lot at nights now. But he's someone to look out for. I think he'll be, Another thing is, I don't know if you know Brandon Terry's article. It's in the Intellectual History Journal, where he's responding to Charles Mills, and he's discussing the fact that in the 1960s, Rawls started a proposal at Harvard to get the faculty at Harvard to oppose the draft in the United States. And the reason for it was that it's racially discriminatory. That, like 40% of the soldiers drafted were African-American, whereas they only made up 14% of the population. And that's because they didn't go to college, right? And Rawls thought, he argued, and this actually went through, Terry talks about it. It went through several cycles with the Harvard faculty to get rid of the draft exemption for, so back during the Vietnam War, anyone who went to college didn't have to go to the Vietnam, didn't have to be in the Army. I mean, when you graduated, you did, but by that time the war was over. And Rawls thought this was just a great injustice. All these white middle class, upper middle class people don't have to fight in the war, and all the poor whites and all the vast majority of blacks do. So he argued this is a great injustice. Of course, the war wouldn't have been possible unless middle class and upper middle class people had to send their children off to war. It would never have gotten started. That's the reason. And he knew that. Yeah, he knew that. So, but you should look at that. That's a great piece. Yeah, it's a great. He worked with Josh Cohen, actually, Brandon Terry. I think he's at Harvard now. Johns Hopkins has made him a job offer, I think. I don't know where he's going. Yeah.
Oh, nice. We'll look for him too. Yeah, Julia found him already. Brandon Terry, Critical Race Theory and the Classical Political Philosophy. Nice. Yeah, we'll take a look at that.
Good.
Thank you very much for the reference, Professor. And once again, thank you for the great class. I mean, we're all very impressed with your work already, and now with you personally. Once again, thank you very much for accepting the invitation. And thank you, Lucas and Julia, for the questions too.
Yes, Lucas. Yeah, Julia.
We're hoping over, we can invite you down here, for proper.
Well, I've never been down there. I'd like to go. My voice teacher's from Brazil. I see. He's he's a very good friend. Yeah, he's from Sao Paulo. Yeah. So. But I want to come down someday. So.
Oh, nice. We'll make sure to extend you an invitation as soon as things go.
If this horrible pandemic ever ends, yeah. All right.
Thank you very much, Professor.
Thank you. Nice to meet you all. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. See you around.
Right. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Bye.
Thank you.